Why Biden's foreign trip is so unique and so important. CNN: Joe Biden's first foreign trip as president comes at a unique moment. No U.S. president has ever left the nation's shores with democratic values under attack as broadly and systemically at home as they are abroad. This extraordinary reality will complicate his mission to first purge the trauma of the Donald Trump era and convince both foes and friends that the US is reclaiming this global leadership role for good. Biden met British Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Thursday before the G7 summit makes a hop to NATO in Brussels that has a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Geneva that will evoke the most tense days of the Cold War. We are going to make it clear that the United States is back and the democracies of the world are standing together to tackle the toughest challenges, Biden told the U.S. troops at an air base in eastern England on Wednesday. For Biden, democracy is not just some abstract concept from civics class that Americans experience only when they enter the voting booths every few years. It's a system, a way of life, and a set of rules and norms that made the United States the strongest and richest country in history. The free, prosperous nations the U.S. rebuilt and protected after World War II faced down a communist tyranny in the form of the Soviet Union and on the road to 70 years of peace. This web of open, like-minded countries is also the key to America's global power. If democracy ebbs abroad, so does U.S. influence. But now it is all under threat. New challenges. The rise of a new superpower, China, determined to overhaul U.S. riches and power, is becoming a grave threat to democracy and offers potential autocrat an alternative power template of one-party rule. Russia, the adversary that Biden will confront at the end of his Europe trip, meddled in the last two U.S. elections to help Trump, who often seems to advance its foreign interest over America's. But the most extraordinary feature of Biden's trip is that he is not an American president going out to confront tyranny abroad. That's happened before. He is huddling with U.S. allies at a moment when the greatest threat to democracy comes from within the United States. The world looked on, horrified, and the resurrection against the U.S. Capitol orchestrated by Trump in January. Since then, the ex-president has poisoned millions of Americans against democracy with his false electoral fraud claims. Republican state lawmakers are quickly passing bills that make it harder for all but their own supporters to vote and make it easier to steal elections. The principle that voters have the right to pick their own leaders is under threat. Trump's method of undermining elections, weaponizing propagandistic news coverage, creating false realities, promoting cronyism and stigmatizing stigmatizing immigrants was painfully familiar to Europeans because of their own history, and as autocracy again took root in the former Eastern Bloc. Biden, who was born during World War II when Nazi tyranny ruled Europe and came of age in the Cold War, has identified a fateful moment. Often, he doesn't sound that convinced that the slumbering West Often he doesn't sound that convinced that the slumbering West can prevail against the threat to freedoms and global dominance of its values that it has taken for granted, especially when he is talking about China. And not even President Franklin Roosevelt had to worry about the state of democracy back home when he crosses the Atlantic for summits during World War II. In homage to Roosevelt, Biden will unveil the updated Atlantic Charter with Johnson on Monday. The documents that FDR's FDR signed with the wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill created the bedrock of the West. Biden is seeking to reinvigorate U.S. alliances that for decades have looked backward to the glories of that era. The oldest president in U.S. history is looking to the future. I believe we are at the inflection point in world history, Biden told American troops. He cited a moment where we fall to us to prove that democracies will not just endure, but they will excel as we rise to seize the enormous opportunities of the new age. And he offered his fellow leader of a warning before this weekend's G7 summit on the rocky Cornish coastline. We have to discredit those who believe that the age of democracy is over, as some of our fellow nations believe, Biden said. A post-Trump boost. The new U.S. president is assured of a warm welcome. After all, he is not his predecessor who berated allies like German Chancellor Angela Merkel preferred the company of autocrats to allies and didn't really believe in the West. But the Trump presidency and the former president's horrifying exit from power traumatized many of America's friends abroad. It made some doubt that democracy can survive in the United States. Privately, diplomats from the allied nations will concede that they are not completely convinced that Biden ended the populist nationalism of America first. Some fear he could be simply an interregnum, and that Trump or a new president in his image can return in January 2025. Part of the rationale of Biden's trip is to begin to calm off those nerves that raise concerns about U.S. staying power. European nations do not need to agree with the United States on every policy issue. But after the upsets of the Trump era, which turned America from a force of global stability to one of disruption, we crave strategic certainty from Washington. What President Biden needs to do is show consistency. credibility in U.S. promises, and to really see this as stabilizing our allies' network within Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, said Heather Corney, Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic and the Center for Strategic and International Studies at the briefing. Our allies will not believe this will hold until they see in several election cycles that regardless of administration, U.S. policy does see the benefit of alliance, Conley said. Still, political leaders are pragmatists. They understand that Biden, despite doubts about his capacity to pass the fullness of his agenda against the Republican obstruction, has more than 3 more years in power. His goals on combating global warming and conquering the pandemic mirror theirs. There is every chance for the first successful foray overseas for the president. Biden's trip opened Wednesday with the news that the U.S. had bought 500 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines and would send them to nations unable to buy bulk supplies themselves. He has already rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, from which Trump withdrew, and the United States will be a crucial player in the next global climate conference in Scotland in November. While the president initially appeared to want to recruit European Union nations for a global compact against China, his team has cooled the rhetoric on the issue somewhat, recognizing that while it stands close to the U.S. on democratic values, the EU doesn't want to pick the sides in a new Cold War. A showdown with Putin. The deliberate choreography of the visit straightened Biden with U.S. allies for almost a week in the United Kingdom and at NATO headquarters in Brussels before he sits down with Putin. If Biden is making himself the personification of global democracy, the Russian leader is the opposite. On Wednesday, the Russian court designated organizations affiliated with the opposition leader Alexei Navalny as extremist. Putin is a supporter of Belarus and its strongman leader Alexander Lukashenko, which recently forced an airliner to land in order to effect the arrest of the prominent journalist and dissident. With his annexation of Crimea and incursions in Ukraine, he has returned the horror of contested borders to mainland Europe. More important from a domestic point of view, the US blames Russia for failing to crack down on ransomware cyber hackers who has targeted US food, water, transport and gasoline infrastructure in recent weeks. And then there is Russian election meddling. CNN has reported that Biden's interest in a summit with the Russian leader was the subject of debate within his administration over the potential risk at a time when Washington-Moscow relations are at their lowest point in decades. While the encounter is likely to feature tough talking, given that the core of Putin's political project is to diminish U.S. power prestige and influence however he can. Biden was seen keen to go ahead. U.S. officials hoped to forge some common ground on Iran nuclear talks and atomic weapons talks, for instance, despite the broader atmosphere of hostility. Biden told the troops in England on Wednesday that he wanted to come face to face with Putin to let him know what I want him to know. After waiting a lifetime to fulfill his dream of being president, Biden, who has traveled the globe as a senator and vice president carrying the messages of others, now has that duty with everyone he meets at a perilous moment for America's power and the world it made.